In deadly love, Susan poured every buried emotion, every bruised memory, every unspoken hurt into a character who existed in the shadows, feeding off vulnerability the way Hollywood had once fed off hers. The role was strange, seductive, dark, and wildly different from anything she had done before, but that was the point. It let her disappear behind someone else, someone who didn't have to smile, or be perfect, or carry the weight of a wholesome image. The world had forced onto her since she was 17, yet even as she acted through blood-stained storylines and eerie nighttime scenes, something inside her was shifting again. The fame that had once felt like oxygen had become suffocating. The scripts coming her way felt hollow. The interviews felt invasive, and the pressure to maintain the legacy of LA Law became unbearable. She told friends she felt watched all the time, that every decision she made was being measured against the girl she used to be or the woman Hollywood expected her to stay. By 1996, after decades of being on sets, under lights, in studios, at award shows, and in gossip columns, Susan began quietly pulling back. She turned down roles, canceled appearances, and stopped accepting interviews. She retreated into her own life the way someone escaping a burning building slips through smoke before anyone notices. She remarried, focused on raising her daughter, and slowly let the world forget the sound of her voice. When producers called her for Partridge Family reunions, she refused every time, her silence firmer than any contract. When interviewed about her past, she gave clipped answers or none at all. She moved north, bought a small farm far from Los Angeles, far from red carpets, far from the city that had chewed her up and applauded at the same time. Today, she spends her days tending to her land, caring for animals, reading, and living quietly, deliberately, stubbornly, on her own terms. She doesn't answer Hollywood's calls because she doesn't need to. The world may remember her as America's sweetheart, the girl with the perfect smile and the soft voice, but the woman she became is something tougher, something quieter, something unbreakably private. She has built a life where no one tells her what to weigh, what to wear, what to smile at, what to hide, or who to be. And after everything she survived, loss, pressure, heartbreak, betrayal, reinvention, the quiet is not loneliness. It is freedom. But behind the cameras, the real transformation was only beginning. Valerie watched her father age with a strange mix of pride and heartbreak. The man who once survived a steel rod spearing through his chest now struggled to climb stairs without pausing for breath. His booming voice grew softer. His hands trembled slightly when he poured his morning coffee. And the towering cowboy who once stared down villains on screen suddenly looked human, fragile. Yet Clint refused to let anyone see weakness. He'd smile, tell one more outrageous story, sign one more autograph even when his fingers cramped. And at night, when the house was quiet, he'd sit alone in his study staring at old photographs of sets, stunts, rodeos, friends, long gone, and whisper, "I hope I made people proud." Valerie realized then that the biggest secret of all wasn't the drinking, the fights, or the marriages. It was that Clint Walker, Hollywood's iron-willed cowboy, had lived his entire life terrified of disappointing the people who loved him. And when he finally confided that to her, voice shaky and eyes wet, Valerie understood the truth she would later share with the world. The strongest men are often the ones holding themselves together by the thinnest thread. In his final years, the facade began to crack in ways even Clint couldn't hide. Valerie remembered visiting one afternoon and finding him sitting in the backyard, boots off, feet in the grass like a child grounding himself after a storm. His face was tired, truly tired. Not the kind TV makeup could fix, and he confessed something she had never expected to hear. "Val, I spent so much of my life trying to be that man people thought I was. The hero, the tough one. But I wasn't always him." His voice trembled, not from age but from years of unspoken guilt. He admitted the mistakes that haunted him, the nights he drank too much, the temper he couldn't always control, the apologies he should have said sooner. But he also admitted the loneliness that carved deeper wounds than any stunt accident. When the cameras stopped, he said softly, "So did the applause, and I didn't know who I was without it." Valerie held his hand as he spoke, realizing this was the true story the world never saw, not the cowboy who rode into danger, but the man who spent decades riding away from his own pain. And in that moment, she finally understood why he had lived behind a wall so high and so carefully built, because even legends sometimes fear being seen for who they really are. As the months passed, Valerie began noticing something else. Her father, once larger than life, was finally letting his guard down. He started telling stories he had buried for decades, stories he once swore he would take to the grave. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the sky turned the same dusty orange as the old westerns he starred in, he told her the truth about the night he almost quit acting forever. It was after a brutal argument on set, fueled by whiskey and exhaustion. He had stormed out, ripping off his costume, ready to disappear into the quiet Wyoming mountains. "I didn't want to be Clint Walker anymore," he said. "I wanted to be Norman, just Norman." It was the first time Valerie realized how deeply the role had swallowed him. He lived for the fans, for the studio, for the image of the perfect cowboy, but rarely for himself. And with a voice so fragile she barely recognized it, he admitted that the fame he worked so hard for had also robbed him of simple things: privacy, peace, real friendships. People loved the cowboy, he whispered, but they never really knew the man. That was the moment Valerie promised herself that one day she would tell his truth. Not the polished Hollywood version, but the raw, complicated, human story of a man who spent a lifetime pretending to be invincible while quietly breaking on the inside. As Clint's health declined, the walls he had spent a lifetime holding up finally began to crumble, and for the first time Valerie saw the full weight he had been carrying alone. Some evenings he would sit in his old leather chair, creased, torn, and sun-faded from decades of use, and stare at the television playing reruns of Cheyenne. He didn't smile. He didn't comment on the scenes. Instead, he watched himself the way a stranger might, carefully, almost analytically, as if trying to understand the man everyone else idolized. Valerie once asked him what he was thinking, and his answer cut straight through her. "I'm wondering if that man was ever really me, or if he was just the only version people allowed me to be." His voice carried the kind of sadness that only comes after a lifetime of being misunderstood in plain sight. He confessed that sometimes, walking through airports or meeting fans, he felt like he was wearing a mask sculpted by the public, one he couldn't take off even when it suffocated him. Yet he also admitted that he feared being forgotten even more. "It's strange," he said. "You spend your youth wanting to be seen, and your old age wishing people knew the real you." And as Valerie listened, she realized that his greatest legacy wouldn't be the cowboy on screen, but the flawed, deeply human man, finally learning to let someone love him without the armor. In those final conversations, Valerie noticed something changing in her father, not in his body, which had grown thin and fragile, but in his spirit. It was as if he had finally stopped running from himself. One night, during a quiet talk in the dim glow of a bedside lamp, he revealed the truth he had never voiced. Not to friends, not to directors, not even to the women he loved. "I was afraid," he said, the words trembling out of him like a confession decades overdue. "Afraid people would walk away if they saw the real me. Afraid I wasn't good enough without the muscles, the stunts, the cowboy smile." Valerie felt her chest tighten. This was the vulnerability he had guarded all his life. He admitted he lived with constant guilt for the times he wasn't there, for the promises he broke, for the emotional distance he hid behind work, fame, and alcohol when the pressure got too heavy. "I thought being strong meant never showing weakness," he whispered, "but all it did was push people away." Valerie looked at him then, really looked at him, and realized that for the first time, he wasn't pretending. The heroic figure America adored had vanished, leaving behind a man who simply wanted forgiveness, understanding, and peace. And in that moment, she promised him something she would carry forever, that she would tell the world not just who Clint Walker was, but who he really was, beneath the legend. After that night, Valerie began writing everything down: his memories, his regrets, his quiet confessions, even the stories he told with a shaky laugh, just to keep the pain away. She realized these weren't just fragments of a man nearing the end of his life. They were pieces of a puzzle the world had never been allowed to see. And as the days grew shorter, Clint's moments of clarity came and went like flickering candlelight. Some mornings he was sharp, recounting tales from the set, remembering which horse preferred which saddle, or reenacting scenes with that same spark in his eyes. Other days he drifted in and out, caught between past and present, calling out names from decades earlier: friends, long gone, stuntmen he respected, lovers he lost, without closure. Valerie would sit beside him, holding his hand through the fog, and he would squeeze her fingers lightly, as if apologizing for slipping away. Once, during a rare moment of lucidity, he looked at her with a soft, almost childlike expression, and whispered, "Did I do enough, Val? Did I leave something good behind?" She felt tears sting her eyes because she finally understood what he feared most: not death, not fading strength, but the idea that his life, for all its fame and glory, might not have meant anything real. And so she leaned close, brushed his hair back, and told him the truth he had doubted for far too long, that the greatest thing he ever left behind wasn't a TV show, a hero, or a legend. It was her, the daughter who loved him even when he couldn't love himself. As spring approached, the air in the house shifted gentler, quieter, almost reverent, like the world itself sensed that a long journey was nearing its final chapter. Valerie began staying overnight more often, sleeping in the chair beside his bed, listening to the soft hum of the oxygen machine that now filled the silence between his breaths. She found herself studying the details of his face, the deep-set lines around his eyes, the rugged jaw that once embodied strength, the faint scars from stunts and accidents he had survived with almost superhuman luck. Now those marks felt less like symbols of toughness and more like stories etched into skin, stories he had finally begun to share. One evening, as a warm breeze drifted through the open window, he woke briefly and looked at her with a clarity that startled her. "You know," he murmured, "I always thought being larger than life meant living larger than life. But it turns out the small moments mattered more. The Sunday breakfasts, the quiet drives, the phone calls I cut short because I thought I was too busy." His voice cracked, and Valerie squeezed his hand, feeling the tremor of years he could never get back. But then, with a soft smile, He added, "At least I figured it out before the credits rolled." She felt her heart twists not from sadness alone, but from the strange, unexpected peace in his tone. For the first time, Clint wasn't speaking as the cowboy, the icon, or the legend the world projected onto him. He was speaking simply as a father, imperfect, apologetic, finally honest. And as she sat beside him in the fading light, Valerie realized that this was the truth she had been searching for all along. Not the scandalous stories or the hidden struggles, but the raw, tender humanity of a man who had spent a lifetime trying to outrun his own vulnerability, and who, at the very end, chose to stop running. In the days that followed, a calmness settled over Clint, the kind of quiet that comes when a person has finally made peace with their own story. Valerie noticed it in the way he breathed slow, steady, unburdened, like a man who had finally set down a weight he'd carried far too long. She spent those days reading aloud to him from old journals, fan letters, even scripts he once memorized with ease. Sometimes he'd smile faintly, recognizing a line or recalling a moment from his past. Other times he would simply close his eyes and listen, letting her voice guide him through memories he was too tired to revisit alone. One afternoon, shortly after she finished reading a letter from a woman who said Clint's characters helped her survive her darkest years, he opened his eyes and whispered, "I wish I'd known. I wish I'd understood what I meant to people while I still felt strong enough to carry it." Valerie leaned toward him, brushing her thumb gently across the back of his hand, and told him he mattered long before he realized it. And for a moment, she saw something in his face: relief, gratitude, maybe even pride. It struck her then how complicated a man's legacy could be, a lifetime of triumphs and regrets, applause and silence, strength and fragility woven together into a single, imperfect story. And as the evening sun cast golden light across the room, Valerie felt an unshakable truth settle in her chest, that her father's journey wasn't defined by the cowboy he played or the legend he left behind, but by these final moments, honest human shared between a man who had spent years hiding his heart and a daughter who finally got to see it. As the nights grew quieter and the house settled into a rhythm of soft footsteps and whispered conversations, Valerie sensed a change she couldn't quite explain, something subtle, almost sacred. Her father slept more deeply now, his breaths shallow but peaceful, as though he were drifting between two worlds and slowly choosing to let go of the one that had demanded so much from him. One night, long after midnight, she sat beside him with the small lamp casting a warm glow across his face. She held his hand, tracing the familiar calluses that had once swung axes, held reins, and gripped stunt ropes without hesitation. Those same hands now rested gently in hers, fragile and weightless. As she watched him, a wave of memories washed over her, the booming laugh that filled their home, the quiet drives through back roads, the rare but cherished moments when he let himself be vulnerable. And then, without opening his eyes, he spoke in a soft, drifting voice. "Val, you stayed." Her breath caught. She squeezed his hand a little tighter. "Of course I stayed," she whispered. He smiled faintly, a ghost of the grin he once flashed on screen. "I didn't make it easy," he murmured. She felt tears rise, not from sadness alone, but from the aching truth in his words. "You made it worth it," she replied. A single tear slipped from the corner of his eye, trailing down the lines time had carved. "You're the best thing I ever did," he whispered. And in that moment, with the night wrapped around them like a curtain falling after a final scene, Valerie felt something shift to quiet, acceptance, a soft surrender. She knew the end was close, not with dread, but with a strange, profound peace. Because for the first time in her life, her father wasn't a cowboy, a hero, or a legend. He was simply a man, finally unafraid to be loved. The next morning, the sunlight spilled into the room, soft and golden, highlighting the stillness that had settled like dust over the house. Valerie stayed close, whispering stories of his youth, of stunts and adventures, of times when laughter had been louder than fear. Clint's breathing was shallow now, each inhale deliberate, each exhale a little slower than the last. She brushed his hair back from his forehead and remembered every role he had played, every performance that had carried him into living rooms across the nation. But none of that mattered here. None of the fame, none of the accolades, none of the applause. All that mattered was the quiet bond they shared in this fragile, final chapter. Hours passed in silence, broken only by the soft ticking of the old wall clock, a sound that had marked countless ordinary moments in their home. Then, as afternoon light warmed the room, his hand twitched slightly in hers, a small, almost imperceptible sign of life, and he opened his eyes just long enough to look at her. "I'm proud of you," he whispered, voice barely audible but laced with years of love and regret, of mistakes made and lessons learned. Valerie's chest tightened, tears slipping freely down her cheeks as she nodded, unable to speak through the knot in her throat. And then, as if he had been holding on for one final moment of connection, his eyes closed softly, and the room fell into an almost holy silence. She sat with him for hours, feeling the weight of his absence pressing in, yet also the warmth of his presence lingering in the air, in the creases of the chair, in the soft hum of sunlight across the floor. It was both heartbreaking and beautiful. the way life could slip away and yet leave everything it had touched forever altered. She whispered goodbye, not to the hero the world had known, but to her father, the man who had been her home, her guide, and her anchor. Outside, the wind rustled through the trees, and for the first time in decades, the world seemed quiet enough to let her grief breathe, to let her remember, to let her love linger even as she let go.